college loans are crushing Gen Z. Today we're going to take a look at Brett Cooper's video from over at the Daily Wire, kind of looking at some of the economic issues that Gen Z is really complaining about. Is there any validity to these claims, or is Gen Z just kind of whining about something that's easily in their control? Let's talk about it.
Welcome back to the comment section. I'm Brett Cooper. So if there's one thing that my generation can agree on, left or right, it is that rent is too expensive, salaries are not increasing, groceries are ridiculously priced, gas is expensive, and buying a home for most people is nearly impossible in this economy.
At least we can all agree on that.
And I see a lot of people pointing fingers at millennials and Gen Z and saying that our problems are simply because we're not working hard enough because we're too lazy. And while that can definitely be true for some people, that really doesn't explain the problem and how we got here, because newsflash, young people aren't totally to blame, and we're going to talk about that today. All right, so I have just been seeing an influx of young people making videos about how disastrous our economy is and how their post-grad adult life is not what they expected it to be. And I mean, these videos are everywhere, so let's dive in. Let's watch one of these.
I'm 24 years old. I graduated from Florida State University with a bachelor's in elementary education and a master's in curriculum and instruction, graduated with a 4.0, and I could not afford to live if I wanted to live by myself. And even then, living with my parents, the cost of living is so high, groceries, everything, that I'm still only able to save a little bit. I couldn't imagine, if you're also paying rent and for everything else, how you could even save to afford a house or ever afford a house. I did the math, and I work probably 50, 60 hours a week with, lesson planning outside of school, grading, all that stuff. And I did the math and it came out to $16 an hour.
She is absolutely correct, because going to school to get a bachelor's and a master's degree to then only get $16 an hour is obviously absurd. And yes, an entire generation has a right to be mad. But I think the root of the issue here is the education system that encouraged her and told her it was necessary to spend all of her time and money to get their expensive degree for an industry that pays so little and will have no positive return on investment.
How can we be expected to teach children to learn how to read if they can't even fit inside the building?
Mostly Peaceful Memes replied and said she wrongly places the blame with her employer for not paying her enough rather than the university that sold her a degree for an overinflated price. Exactly. Like, that is the point that I'm going to be focusing on for this entire episode. Because do not get me wrong, teachers should be getting paid better than that, and that is why the number of teachers is drastically decreasing every single year. But it's criminal that colleges are convincing students that all the time and all the money that they will spend there will be worth it, when factually it is not.
So I get what Brett Cooper is saying, but let's think about it logically. Is it really the college's fault that the teacher is making $6 an hour with a master's degree? Even if she had been sold that master's degree at 1960s prices, $16 an hour is not enough to survive today. So I actually agree with Brett, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. The education system is overpriced, it's bloated, there's a lot of problems with it, but $16 an hour is not enough to survive for anybody, whether you're a college educated or not. $16 an hour is not going to get you food and pay for rent. The fact that they even offered that to somebody with a master's degree is mind-blowing.
There is nobody in 2023 that can live off of $19 an hour. Unless you're living with somebody, unless you have roommates and multiple roommates at that, I feel like that's the only way that you could really do it. The previous generations us over just off the strength that they set us up, and we did every single thing that we were told to do. We went to college, we got the degree, and if you didn't, you're probably working 2-3 jobs right now as a result. And even if you have a college degree, it's still, you have to market yourself, and you still have to work your ass off to be able to even obtain some type of livable wage out here.
Now, I really like the gist of this video, and I completely empathize with her. There are some things that I disagree with her about, that nobody can survive on $40,000 a year, because I know that there are people out there that do, and that they are budgeting, they are making it work, they are choosing to sacrifice and live with roommates, they are choosing to move out of a bigger city and live somewhere else. It's very odd that she's kind of saying, oh my God, if you didn't go to college, you're probably having to work, 2 or 3 jobs because you're not as well off. I think that stuff was a bit odd, but the main thing that I want to hone in on is her saying we did everything we were told. We got the degree, we went to college, I thought we were doing everything right, and we are still in this situation. And that's the really heartbreaking part. And that is the crux of most of these videos that I've seen. Because the system that young people were told to believe in, that they were told to follow, has failed them, and everything is crumbling around them, and most of them, a lot of them, are ill-equipped to handle the mess. But we'll touch on that a little bit later. But the point is that these young people were handed crippling debt and a terrible economy from past generations. But on top of that is the fact that they were lied to about higher education and the power of these fancy degrees that they're getting, and what it means to be in that kind of debt at such a young age.
What Brett's saying here is pretty accurate. Gen Z really did do what they were told to do by the older generations in order to succeed. And it's not working out for them. We're still struggling financially. Economically, Gen Z is not in the best of places. But I do think that despite the fact that this is a painful lesson, this is a really good lesson for my generation. Don't just blindly trust older generations because they're older than you. Don't just blindly trust these mainstream narratives like, hey, if you go to college, you're going to make a lot of money, right? I think it's almost good that while we're young, we're being exposed to some of these lies that hopefully is going to build a little bit of a skepticism in us as a generation more broadly. And fingers crossed, maybe this teaches us something about how we interact with government, businesses, institutions. Maybe this makes us a little harder to scam in the future, especially with politicians and whatnot. Maybe we use this and Gen Z goes back to owning something rather than just being basically scammed by the next smooth talker, which is kind of what prior generations have seemed to do, right? Whichever politician, businessman comes in and talks the smoothest is able to sort of rob the middle class. Fingers crossed, hopefully my generation learns from this.
Gen Z is right, as are millennials. Baby boomers did wreck the economy and saddled us with the debt from their lifestyle and bad choices, but younger people are responsible for failing to understand the true causes of their plight, progressive spending and policies. Until they wise up and turn against them, it'll be more of the same. Yes, because
Whoa. The thing that frustrates me about this is that the right and the left, they love to play political football with the economy and the real struggles that we're living through today. It's like this big football game so that they can get points on the other side. Let's talk about facts. Yes, a lot of progressive policies are not good for the economy, right? Spending more money, we don't need that right now. The US is in a big debt crisis. Big programs that have been sort of touted as the new progressive agendas, like forgiving student loan debt sort of at a federal level, that's a terrible idea. That's going to speed up the collapse of the US dollar, which is already a weak currency thanks to our politicians. We don't want to do things like that. We don't need more reckless spending. It is true that progressive ideas a lot of times are not good for the economy. And I think when you're in a healthy economy, maybe there's a debate that can be had about that, social obligations, responsibilities, that kind of thing. But we're in real danger of the US dollar losing its sort of world reserve currency status, meaning the average sort of living of an American is going to take a major hit if the US dollar is no longer the go-to currency for countries around the world. It's something that we have to take seriously, and we've got to be sort of conservative or fiscally conservative with our money, right? But let's just be honest here, right? Brett wants to say like these progressive ideas are the problem. Okay, well, let's look at who got us off the gold standard. Who made it so that the US dollar was no longer tied to gold, to where the US could spend unlimited money? The politicians had essentially an unlimited credit card. Which politician got us off the gold standard? Richard Nixon, a Republican, right? You want to look at recent history, which administration was over the Federal Reserve in 2020 when over $4 trillion was printed in about a year's time? Donald Trump, right? Again, a Republican. So it's a little bit disingenuous to go, oh, it's just the progressives. Because Republicans and conservatives have totally lost any ground to stand on to talk about fiscal responsibility. The Republicans have not been fiscally responsible in I don't know how long. And let's keep it fair, right? The Biden administration, right, overseeing their Fed, has printed trillions more too, right? It's not a left or right issue. It's both parties. It's the uniparty, right? That's what these politicians do. They spend money by printing money that we don't have, and then you have to pay the sort of hidden silent tax of inflation. And on top of that, the dollar is devalued, and it's hurting all of us. So you can't just say it's the progressive agenda, it's the progressive politicians, the progressive policies. Both parties are to blame here. Both parties are guilty. And instead of playing political football and sort of making it a left-right issue, I wish people would be a little bit more fair and really be honest with what's happening. We are headed off a cliff. The United States is not in a good position. And I think there's a few things that have to happen that neither party is going to want to do because it's politically unpopular. First of all, we've got to reform government, probably cut it like 50% if we don't want our currency to collapse and our country to head downhill like we've seen with Venezuela. And on top of that, I think it might be a good thing if we return to the gold standard, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Politicians don't want to give up their unlimited credit cards.
I just watched my 87th TikTok about how a couple who was married and both have college degrees can't buy a house. Can we all just level?
I'm telling you, these videos are everywhere. Everywhere.
There are people who come out of college that are educated. There are people who come out of college who are papered. And you know what I mean. I am done pretending that if you have a college degree, you are educated. Because I cannot, for the life of me, I cannot understand how someone who is going, I make $50,000 a year, and they cannot, for some reason, connect the fact that, babe, when you were 17, you signed a loan, an unforgivable loan. You paid a ridiculous amount of money to make 0 to 5 years out of college. The median is $48K. Is the economy bad? Yes. The economy has been bad before. But the thing that was never as bad is the cost of college, which doubles every 9 years.
Which is just insane. And that's a really incredible point that even I had not thought about. And I talk about the education system all the time, and I talk about these student loans, and I talk about how awful it is that these universities lie to students and bamboozle them into getting these degrees. But I think this is an excellent point because yes, we've been through recessions before, we've had bad economies before, but this is totally different. And she's right. The amount of debt people are racking up, it is increasing every single year because these universities are able to, because they can just increase their tuition because again, they're getting the money either way. They don't care. So why wouldn't they? Because they're a for-profit business and the government is allowing them to because they're just handing out cash.
If you look at all of the programs that government's made for higher education in the last 50, 60 years, all of it really serves to do one thing, which is ultimately drive up the cost of the degree. In the 50s and 60s, the government said, hey, we're going to start guaranteeing student loans for universities. What does that do? Universities feel safer about increasing tuition costs. More recently, the government started offering FAFSA, which is essentially free money from the government to help those with less money to get through college. What do colleges now feel safer to do? Increase the cost of tuition because they know students are going to get thousands from the government to help them pay for it. The government makes it so that student loans can't be forgiven in your own personal bankruptcy. What does that do? That makes colleges feel safer to increase tuition because, even if they declare bankruptcy, they can't get rid of this debt. They'll have to pay it back and be our slave forever. And then fourth, probably the most divisive and recent action is you've got administrations talking about just forgiving student loans. What does that do? Again, universities feel safer to increase the cost of tuition, make education more expensive, because you know what? The government's probably going to forgive some of it. So even if we keep going higher, the taxpayer is going to have to pay. So I understand that some of you guys maybe left-leaning are going to look at it and go, no, we need the government to make college cheaper. I look at it and go, every time the government's gotten involved, it's only gotten more expensive.
This isn't just, a $40,000 loan. It isn't like, I'm getting my first car loan. No, this is like 6 figures. It's insane. And all of this has created a reality where now millennials and those growing up after millennials are coming into adulthood and realizing that they can't buy homes. They can't build wealth like generations before them did. They can't even live without roommates. And they're looking back and going, where did I go wrong? Because like that girl in the original video said, they've been doing everything right. They did what they were told. These generations have a right and a reason to be mad, and they should express that anger. But they shouldn't be angry at the capitalist system or their company that's not paying them enough, or the billionaire businessmen at the top, unless you're talking about the millionaires in government that did this to you. The blame should be attributed to the corrupt politicians and the progressive policies that caused this, and we should be angry at the schools for pushing subsidized student loans and completely meaningless degrees that set students up for failure from the get-go. But I think the hardest part is that even though we should be angry that this is our current situation, that this is the hand that our generations were dealt, we do still have to admit that this is simply the reality. And we have to accept that life is not fair, and we do have to adapt.
Brett and I are on the same page here. I don't think that capitalism is the primary thing that we should be blaming. It really is the government and their mismanagement of money and their inability to create just incentive structures that actually make sense and promote good behavior. We just talked about how all of this legislation that they passed around universities and trying to make it more accessible have just driven up the cost and made it less accessible. That's what government excels in. Bad policy. That's what they do. But I also think that the older generation shares some of the blame in this, right? They lived a lavish lifestyle for 60, 70 years, running up our debt with no real plan to pay that back. And the cherry on top for me is when I see the older generations blaming the kids. You guys took out this debt, so now you have to pay it back. You guys are the ones who picked these degrees that aren't paying good. It's like, well, the kids weren't really thinking for themselves, right? They heard the baby boomers, right? Millennials, Gen X, talk for years, talk for decades about how college was the way to a better life. And so they did what they were told. They tried to check the boxes, tick the boxes for a greater life based on the information that was given by you guys, the older generations, right? So I have to look at this and just go, how can you blame the kids all that much, right? And the kids, we should be more in control of our lives. I agree with that. We're in the situation that we're in, and now we have to make our own decisions. But part of that and part of doing it right is acknowledging some of the mistakes that have been made in the past by past generations. Once again, the older generations spent endless amounts of money, had a credit card and ran it up and said, we have no way to pay this back. So what we're going to do is we're going to have fewer kids and we're going to make them pay it back. That's our genius plan. That's what we're going to do to drive America to prosperity. We're going to serve our best interest by having fewer kids and making them pay back more debt. That was the strategy, right? Serving their own self-interest. Older generations also, I guess serving their best interest, decided that it was more worth their while to go bomb some foreign country every 5 years and spend billions obliterating whatever small country it was going to be for this decade, as opposed to helping out our own sort of families that are struggling here at home. right? That's been the history. That's been the playbook. Help our own self-interest by bombing these other countries, these people at home that are struggling, they're poor, it's their fault. Let's just go drop some more bombs. That was the strategy. The older generations also let the world's greatest faith be eradicated from polite society. We no longer have an identity as sort of a Christian nation or a God-fearing nation even, right? We've allowed that to just be taken out of every institution, every conversation in our society. We've decided that apparently that doesn't mean anything to us. And what does that mean? That means that people don't have meaning. People don't have purpose, principles, morals to guide them like we've had in the past. And the obvious flaw with this is that our brains are just attributing meaning to things as we go and as we see fit. It's all subjective. There's no more objective truth, right? The problem with this is that what one person's brain sees is not necessarily always the truth. Humans are very flawed. And so if you're attributing your own meaning and trying to create your own purpose in life, it's like we've got a whole society doing that. We have no sort of common ground and there's no humility. I think the two major things that Gen Z has to do is return to God, return to faith in that higher purpose, but also sort of create a new social contract with the country to say, look, what is our purpose here and what is our future going to be? What is our purpose of being born in America? What do we want to accomplish? Because right now we really don't have sort of a national identity for where we're headed. It's all subjective. And I think the past 70-year trend of sort of rejecting God and acting in self-interest being our national identity hasn't been positive, right? Look at some of the things that have come from this, from rejecting God, pushing him out of polite society, and having every man just go and serve his own self-interest, as opposed to having some greater purpose or sort of community-driven interest. So I agree with Brett. This is where we're at. This is what we're dealing with. And I'm not trying to point the finger just for the sake of pointing the finger at older generations, but we have to be honest and come to grips with, here's what's been done in the past and here's why it's not working. Okay, now that we've identified that, we can select a new path for the future. But right now, I don't think a lot of people are even having these conversations. So I think it's awesome when people like Brett have these conversations publicly to say, hey, look at how the system's failing us. We got to figure out something new for the next generation.